Hey everybody, I'm back. Now, after Evo and Versus fighting being so close together, I managed to get sick. Sorry about the lack of uploads, but with today's video, I just had to get something together, so excuse me if I sound a bit terrible. The Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection by Digital Eclipse has announced its final list of titles. It is a mega collection with all sorts of MKs playable when the game eventually releases, including the likes of Mythologies and even Special Forces. But the reason I'm making today's video is because of the final few seconds at the end of the recent trailer. We can see the WaveNet logo and a cut into gameplay of Noob Saibot. Now you'd be forgiven for not knowing what any of that means at all, but let me clue you in. It is a very big deal. WaveNet Ultimate MK3 is the final revision of UMK3. It includes significant in-game changes and even a playable Noob Saibot on arcade hardware. The only catch is that this version was tied to WaveNet, which was a standalone series of arcade machines hooked up to the internet, and it would only last a short time before the project was eventually discontinued, leaving this version of the game completely lost in history. And up until, well, basically right now, was complete lost media. I made a video on lost media a few years ago and did a portion on WaveNet, but I want today's video to dive into a bit more detail about some of its features. My goal today is to fully bring you all up to speed on what WaveNet was, and why this inclusion in the collection is genuinely the biggest surprise in the entire list. I can't believe they've been able to somehow restore this. Now, some of you may be wondering why there hasn't been any MK Legacy Collection content on this channel. Now, I'm sure you can understand I can't go into heaps of detail here for obvious reasons. The short of it is, Mustard and myself were both interviewed for the project. I don't know how it's going to be used. I don't know how it's going to fit into the grand scheme of things, but because we didn't interview for the Legacy Collection, it just didn't feel quite right to us reporting on upcoming news and new games and stuff like that in the collection when we had an interview done ahead of time. So hopefully that clears things up. That said, my name is Ketchup, and today we're going to look at the history of Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 on WaveNet. WaveNet stands for Williams Action Video Entertainment Network. The idea was that players could play certain games online, connecting directly to Midway's Chicago headquarters using a dedicated T1 line. The main games that people recall these days are Mortal Kombat, and I do mean recall, because as I've said many times about WaveNet, genuinely finding video footage of this thing seems completely impossible, and even finding screenshots of the game in action is just as hard. All we've ever had to go by are old forum posts and message boards, so everything I say in this video has to be taken with a pinch of salt, especially as the version is going to finally become playable and we can all finally put these comments to the test. According to a list I found online from an old message board, MK3 used a weird processor from Texas Instruments, and the game designers essentially pushed the CPU to its max before the WaveNet group were able to make it function online. By the time it came to adding online capability, there actually wasn't enough RAM, CPU, or ROM left to pull the whole thing off. So what the team did was design this super tiny board that plugged into an expansion connector to the game board. That way, the online functionality was possible due to the extra resources. WaveNet started with vanilla Mortal Kombat 3 somewhere around the spring of 1996, and then somewhere around August for Ultimate MK3. The games began as a simple port of the same final revision, and then, over time, Ultimate MK3 would receive changes that makes WaveNet Ultimate MK3 actually the final revision of the game. The issue with WaveNet, and why so many of you have never heard of it until recently, was that this idea was launched during the beginning of the arcade decline in the States, and it was essentially location tested in 2 arcades, one in San Francisco and one in Chicago. If I'm correct, the arcade in Chicago was called Distractions, where at this time, Many players were grinding Mortal Kombat 4. From what I've been told by friends of the era, WaveNet Ultimate MK3 was somewhat in the background at some of these places. Now, I'm sure people did play the game, and from old 90s message boards, it confirms that people did play against each other, but it was past the game being the main Mortal Kombat that people would play, as MK4 was out and more recent for the time. Another major issue was the cost of everything. The price of a T1 line was astronomical, costing thousands per arcade installation, and then hundreds for each individual cabinet using the hardware. Now, according to Wikipedia, the plan from Williams was to use WaveNet to upload new games and updates. They would provide it to the arcade owners for a cut of the game's generated revenue. Back then, the only way to get broadband into an arcade was this T1 line, and it was just so insanely expensive for business owners that it hindered any chance of growth, I suppose. Now, I'm talking about thousands of dollars for installation fees. This was back in the 90s as well, where obviously the exchange rate and everything else was very different, so I imagine it was even more expensive. According to the internet, though, only 20 WaveNet Mortal Kombat machines were ever produced. Period. 8 vanilla MK3 machines and 12 Ultimate MK3 machines. Remember too that this was spread across different arcades, so each individual venue would have less than that. But people could connect online, so I suppose it's not as bad. Online connectivity was the entire goal of WaveNet, after all. Once the ported versions were ready to go, changes would be made to Ultimate MK3 to adjust the game balance. I've said this before, but this is why WaveNet is considered the final revision of the game. But in the grand scheme of things, only a small handful of players in history have actually played or even seen this in action. Now, I want to list some of these changes that we found online, but again, please take it as statements from people online back in the 90s. We kind of have no choice but to take their word for it for now, but hopefully it won't be long until the collection is actually out and we can all find out firsthand what's what. First of all, Striker's Infinite is removed. Striker's combo that involved multiple gun loops, both mid-screen and in the corner, were adjusted. Instead of the standard combo, the game would come up with some kind of message that said, "Stop that," or "Stop cheating," among other messages. Eventually, it was also said by people that Striker's gun would fail to come out after a certain amount of combo hits, which would also remove the infinite potential, while in theory keeping a decent damage B&B, but again, remains to be seen. The exact same thing was said to happen with Kung Lao's Spin Infinite, the same principle and the same situation with a supposed hit limit until the spin no longer comes out. A big one that people talk about, and the most discussed change on various forums and everything else, was a nerf to Cabal. Supposedly, the Nomad Dash had extra startup frames and some kind of explosion noise when the move is executed. Nomad Dash is one of the main reasons that Cabal is so messed up in this game, so a slower Nomad Dash may even have put Human Smoke into the #1 spot instead, unless he receives some changes that haven't been documented, but we'll wait and see for that one. There are some unconfirmed changes, but apparently Ermac's Telekinetic Slam had a larger area. That would be wild because Ermac's already a top 5 character, but if that's the case, fair enough, I guess. But this is a change I've only seen from one person, so I can't say for sure if it is true. The same was said about a supposed Cyrax change where his throw has a larger pop-up, which in theory creates larger combos. That would be a good change though, because Cyrax is some ass in Ultimate MK3. But like I've said, these changes are what I've seen from one place and one person, so no idea if it's true or not. The biggest thing about this game, and something we know for a fact is true, is that Noob Saibot is actually playable. I believe the MK3 vanilla version had the Kano sprite, which was what Noob Saibot was back in vanilla MK3, but Ultimate MK3 having the actual ninja version and even having a teleport slam listed as a move is monumental. It is the one and only time that Noob Saibot has been playable on arcade and not relegated to console exclusivity. We saw him in the minute teaser trailer that Digital Eclipse released, and yeah, he's in there all right. Other features in the WaveNet version are a little bit all over the place online, but again, I want to list some of the documented features that can be found on the internet. The first one was the price. Something I've never really heard about before because it wasn't your standard winner stays on system like most arcade machines from back in the day. A player would put 3 tokens in to start the machine, and then after 10 wins, you actually had to put in more tokens to continue playing. 5 wins after that, and you have to put more tokens in yet again. Now, I'm so used to arcade machines just basically letting you go for as long as you keep winning. The idea of having to pay to stay on, even if you're on an unbeaten streak, is just crazy to me. Maybe it was a way to try and gain more revenue. It could have been, I don't know, server space or something. I've got no idea, but it was certainly a different approach by the sound of things. There was apparently a little bonus a player could do by holding down certain button combinations at the right time as the game was loading up. Doing it correctly would allow Raiden, Noob Saibot, and Rain to pop up and do their victory poses, followed by a original Mortal Kombat and MK2 machine falling behind them. Apparently, if you did it at a different screen, instead of saying Ultimate MK3 WaveNet Edition, it would say Nitro Edition instead. Now, one thing that is different here versus a standard arcade version was that you had 2 options. The local play, which would put you against the computer, and the option for multiplayer, where you can input a name and begin searching across other WaveNet machines in the country. Now, what I really want to know is, can this version be played offline with 2 people locally? As it very much is a new version of the game. I'm sure people would want to try that and just play it as a new version of Ultimate MK3, but I haven't found a single record online that talks about people playing a local 1 versus 1, which would be something I definitely hope is possible, even in something as old as this. Players could still decline challenges online too, so people would try and use that as a means to avoid playing the same person too many times in a row. I'm very interested about the local system though, because if the cabinet was only supporting 1 person per attempt, that would have in theory made local play impossible. But again, I haven't found a single record confirming that. One funny story I found on a message board from 1996 is that the beauty of WaveNet is, and I quote, "One of the best things about it, in my opinion, is that the moronic no throwing rule is going to go out of the window pretty darn quickly. Everybody at Dennis's place throws, and so when that happens, other arcades with chumps who don't know how to deal with it get creamed. Everybody on the WaveNet is going to have to learn to play with throws." I mean, it was certainly a different time, wasn't it? Remember, people actually back then would get annoyed if you did certain techniques that they didn't like, and yeah, I guess this is just a nice little reminder of that. Speaking of stories, here's another one. A sign of how the internet was a new thing and certain tactics were no longer as effective. Another user says, "Another drawback is not seeing your opponent. I never paid attention to my opponent's hands, but there are almost subconscious things you pick up without paying attention, like if they're tapping a button over and over again, or moving the joystick in a complex way to get a special move or a morph out. You can't get any of that when your opponent isn't next to you. This can kind of be good, since it's more of a challenge. But if you're an arsehole like blank at Times Square, and all you know how to do is pick Cyrax every time and do a throw high kick combo wherever it's remotely possible, which means it's more frequent now because of those tiny delays and special moves, you can get away with it without having your arse kicked for real. Ugh, imagine losing to Cyrax in old MK3 though, terrible character. Ultimately, it was a revolutionary idea that players could compete head-to-head over the internet, and the updated version made it all the more attractive, But realistically, the arcade scene wasn't as thriving at the time of its release, and various factors prevented WaveNet from really kicking off the way they probably wanted it to. But that didn't stop it from being a significant part of the arcade era's history. From total lost media to finally playable for all to see, this is the biggest part of the Legacy Collection for me. I can't wait to exactly see what the deal is, and just how different this version will end up being now that the masses at home can finally dive in and properly explore it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.